Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Would you please welcome the Professor of Jazz Voice in the George Washington University's Department of Music, Allison Crockett.
Good evening. Oh, let's have a little more. Good evening. There we go. My name is Allison Crockett, and I'm going to be singing a song by one of the most famous residents of Foggy Bottom, Duke Ellington. So I'm going to do Come Sunday. Lord, dear Lord above, God Almighty, God of love, please look down and see my people through. Lord, dear Lord above, God Almighty, God of love, please look down and see my people through. I believe that God set sun and moon up in the sky. I don't mind the gray skies, 'cause they're just clouds passing by. Lord, dear Lord above, God Almighty, God of love, please look down and see my people through.
Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome the President of the George Washington University, Dr. Stephen Knapp.
That's a little hard to follow. Good evening. And thank you, Professor Crockett, for that wonderful opening of our program. It's really a pleasure to welcome all of you to tonight's discussion, which is entitled Voices, Celebrating the African American Legacy in Foggy Bottom. This event is part of our celebration of the university's 100 years in Foggy Bottom. We arrived here in 1912. We were on one little strip of G Street between 20th and 21st Street. And now, of course, we've grown substantially. We only had 1,000 students at that time in 1912. And we came into a community rich in history and diversity and as you've just heard, wonderful, wonderful music. And we're very proud to be part of this community. This program this evening was inspired by the George Washington University's Centennial Black History Month oral interviews, which are being conducted at Gelman Library. Catherine Mead, who is a graduate student, first-year graduate student in American history, has worked on that project along with Dr. Bernard Demchuk, Assistant Vice President. And this is I think, a pretty extraordinary project that will provide future historians with the ability to reflect on what it was like growing up in Foggy Bottom in the 20th century. And this project will make the actual voices of those who lived in Foggy Bottom available to scholars into the far future. I'm also delighted to acknowledge our panelists this evening, whom you'll be meeting in just a moment. These are all citizens of this wonderful neighborhood who've called it their home. And I do hope you enjoyed the music. It was, again, Allison Crockett singing Come Sunday, which is from the suite Black, Brown, and Beige by Duke Ellington. It was performed for the first time, premiered in Carnegie Hall in 1942. So that's the 30th year of our presence here. So we're really tying together a lot of history this evening. Edward Kennedy Duke Ellington, perhaps the most famous person born in Foggy Bottom. I think it's fair to say the most famous person so far born in Foggy Bottom. Really regarded by many as the greatest American composer, was born here on April 29th in 1899, which means he was 13 years old when the university relocated to Foggy Bottom in 1912. It's now a distinct honor to introduce the moderator of this evening's presentation, a man who has also brought great distinction to this neighborhood, Colby King. Mr. King grew up in Foggy Bottom, just a few blocks from here at 24th and L Street. He attended the Thaddeus Stevens Elementary School, then Francis Junior High School. He graduated from Paul Laurence Dunbar High School before earning a Bachelor of Arts degree from Howard University. Colby King is a renowned columnist for the Washington Post, where he specializes in urban and national affairs, and where he formerly served as deputy editorial page editor. In 2003, he won the Pulitzer Prize for Distinguished Commentary. In 2005, he received an award for Outstanding Editorial Commentary from the Chesapeake Associated Press Broadcasters Association. Mr. King is also a regular panelist for ABC TV's Inside Washington and a frequent commentator on WTOP radio. Earlier in his career, he served as a commissioned officer in the United States Army and held positions with the State and Treasury Departments, the United States Senate, and the World Bank. It's always a delight to welcome him back to Foggy Bottom and to the George Washington University. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Colby King.
Yeah, good question. Actually, that photograph you're looking at was taken on June the 26th, 1951, my graduation day from Stevens Elementary School. You see a picture of my mother, Amelia, my sister, Lucretia, my brother, Cranston, and the photo was taken by my father. In the background is Columbia Hospital for Women. It's taken in front of our house, which is at the corner of 24th and L Streets Northwest. My mother, my father, and Columbia Hospital are now gone. But the memory of that day and the times in which we live on. We call the area Foggy Bottom. We lived slightly north of Pennsylvania Avenue, so technically it was West End, but it was really Foggy Bottom for us. It was where everything happened to us that was in the family. We had births there, we had deaths there, we had sorrow there, we had a lot of joy, but the main thing was it was community for us. This evening we will recall those times, and through the recollection of many of you here in the audience. We also have three special guests who will help us travel down memory lane. It is now my pleasure to welcome this evening's guests. Mary E. Brown was born in September 1920, 1 month after the adoption of the 19th Amendment was passed, giving women the right to vote. She spent over 30 years living in Foggy Bottom and very much enjoyed her neighborhood.
Well, you know, when you grow up in a place, sometimes you grow up in a space, you say, I'm glad to get out of it. But I like the area, the people, and it's just something about Foggy Bottom that keeps me there. I can't tell you exactly what it is, but I just love it.
Would you please welcome our first guest, Mary E. Brown. David Riley, who was born in January of 1945, didn't remember as a child very much hearing the neighborhood referred to as Foggy Bottom.
I served 300 papers during the weekdays and 400 on Sundays.
Right.
From 15 to 18. And I also sold papers down in the Department of Interior after I finished serving papers, and sold papers down there. And then in the evening, I sold papers at the Interior Department and the Navy Annex.
Would you please welcome Mr. David Riley? Mr. James Briscoe was born in the summer of 1950 and remembered a neighborhood where doors did not have to be locked.
Nobody's doors were locked. If you were hungry, I don't know how the other families knew you were broke and hungry, but they would take care of you. I always relate that to Hillary Clinton's statement, it takes a village. We had a village here in Foggy Bottom. Without anybody trying to put it together, we had a village here in Foggy Bottom.
Would you please welcome Mr. James Briscoe? Among the subjects discussed by the dozen or so former Foggy Bottom residents, let me say that again. Former Foggy Bottom residents involved in the GW Centennial Black History Month oral interview project were their experiences attending schools in this area. You all attended elementary and high school before the Supreme Court ruling outlawing segregation in public schools. Alameda Hansborough, who was born in 1917, told the GW Foggy Bottom Oral History Project what it was like going to public schools in Foggy Bottom in the early 1920s.
I mean, we did identify ourselves as colored, but only if we were asked. You know, most of the time people didn't have to ask you. You know, because in Washington, if you went to a certain school, you were, you know, the race was quite apparent.
Let me ask each one of you this question. You all attended Stevens Elementary School.
I did.
What was your real recollection of Stevens School? Let me start with you, Mary Brown.
I didn't go to Stevens.
You didn't?
No, I went to Montgomery School on 27th Street.
Briggs Montgomery School?
No, just plain Montgomery at the time, yes.
When did Briggs come in?
After they built Whitehurst Freeway and renovated the Parkway. And then I went to Briggs at 22nd and Virginia Avenue, which was called Briggs Montgomery. No Stevens.
No Stevens.
That wasn't close.
You could stay anyway.
Okay, thank you.
Let me ask you, your recollection, Mr. Riley.
I went to Briggs Montgomery. Briggs Montgomery Elementary School was on 20, 7th and I, between I and K.
That was plain Montgomery.
Briggs Montgomery when I went.
Did you go to Stevens School?
Yes, sir.
Oh. What's your recollection of Stevens School?
Well, my recollection, I think, it's probably a word I learned later, but it was a multicultural school. We had people from everywhere, and I didn't realize that then, but once I grew older, I realized we've had this all along in Old Foggy Bottom. You know, the world is trying to get there, and we were already there in the 50s, you know.
Now, you all attended, let me ask this, Francis Junior High School.
Yeah, we all attended.
Yes.
May I ask your recollection of Francis Junior High School?
All right. I remember going to Francis Junior High School. One thing that stood out in my mind was lunchtime. But going to grade school, my mother always packed the lunch because she wanted us to eat what she had cooked. But when you got to junior high school, you were considered grown up. But the lunch program there was hot dog, potato salad, and Jell-O every day. But it was good. So if you didn't want to spend money to buy your lunch and you volunteered to work in the cafeteria, Miss Thomas say, well, you can stay here, you can work here, and we'll give you free lunch. But that's what you ate every day, lunch, for lunch. Hot dogs, potato salad, and Jell-O. But we had some very good teachers, and they were very strict. I remember some of them, especially for the boys. The shop teachers had this nice long metal ruler, and they would whack you with it. They'd whack the boys with them. But of course, the other teachers would keep you after school if you weren't good. So we had very good teachers. Everyone that came out of Francis Junior High, I think they went on to the higher levels and really made good in the world.
I know Mr. Tenner, who shop
Yes.
at Francis, had two weapons. One he called the bone crusher, and the other is a name that I cannot repeat in this big story.
That's right.
But I experienced all of that. Your experiences?
My experience in France was a great one. And we, like she said, we had some teachers with disciplinarians, particularly Mr. Burke with the boys. I know they'll call people's parents and they would say it's child abuse, but back in that time, Mr. Burke would actually smack you with his open hand. Exactly. If he caught you out of line, he would smack you.
Yeah, that's true.
But I enjoyed Francis. You know
He
that.
smacked me.
Yeah, you know that with open hand.
Smacked my father too when he was there.
With his open hand.
Did you get smacked?
Well, they must have been cloning teachers because I don't recognize the names, but I definitely recognize the same actions. We had sheet metal teachers that had sheet metal paddles. The woodcraft teachers had wood paddles. But they weren't the same names, but they took the same actions. So
Same
it was
pain.
It was a
though.
disciplined type
Same
of
pain.
environment, but a good environment.
But if you're all Francis graduates, obviously you all know the Francis theme song.
Did it change?
Shall we sing it all together?
I don't remember.
Go ahead.
Dear Francis, hail how we love thy name. May we ever never fail to be true. You guys didn't go to
No,
France.
no.
Mary Brown did. but-
We forget, at our age now, we forget. Maybe you're a little younger, you should remember. You too.
Maybe he should remember. He's the youngest.
He's the youngest.
Yeah.
Young people.
That's why I'm out here.
Their minds are not where the old folks' minds
We
are.
didn't remember the words, remember the tune.
The Foggy Bottom residents who were interviewed for this project were all eager to share their work experiences growing up in this area. Ruth Mclaughlin, Reid, was born in March of 1937. She remembered race as being part of her early work experiences.
Oh yes, that was the same with jobs. Even when I graduated from high school, they were still advertising jobs for black and colored and white. You know, like a typist, it would be 40 words a minute, $150 a week. White typist, 150 words a minute, $40 a week. Colored. Now that was in the 50s.
Let me ask you, did Foggy Bottom offer, and this is for Mary Brown, did Foggy Bottom offer jobs and work opportunities to members of your family, or did you have to travel outside of Foggy Bottom to find work?
My father worked on K Street for the Warren Area Roofing Company for all of my life, as far as I can remember. My brothers sold newspapers, worked for the newspapers, stuffed newspapers down at the old Star Building on weekends. My older brother worked at a dental lab, which was down on New York Avenue someplace. And when I was a teenager, I worked at, was it Park Lane or something up on Pennsylvania, and I bussed tables after school. So there was something going all the time if you wanted to work. And usually everyone wanted to work because they liked to have pocket money.
Did you have to go outside of the neighborhood? Did your family have to travel outside of the neighborhood too?
Well, my family, I think, most people found work in Foggy Bottom down the K Street area. They had the Carson Groom Construction Company, they had a concrete company, they had a Huffmar down there, and a lot of jobs around there. So I think most people from Foggy Bottom worked in that area.
Was that also your experience, Mr.?
I think it's somewhat similar to that experience. Most of my folks worked in this area. I was always amazed at the opportunities that we had as younger folks, newspaper delivery, different things that you could make, extra money. I know one of my biggest times of the year was when it snowed. We could shovel the embassies and make enough money. You'd get frostbitten, but it was worth it,
Let me ask one more question about the work environment. The family members who worked in this area or outside of the area, did they work with people of different races, with white people as well? Yes. And if they did, who tended to be the supervisor?
I have no idea who my father's supervisor was, but I imagine there was a mixture. Of course, we had like French, German, Italian, whatever in our neighborhood, and they all worked together. So he never said who was the supervisor, who was in charge, as they would say in those days.
I never knew who the supervisors were. I don't know whether they were blue, green, black, white. I don't know. I know when I was a kid serving papers, I know what color mine was.
Knew what?
My supervisor.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was Mr. Schultz, Caucasian, and I served 300 papers during the weekday, 400 on Sundays. And I was grateful for that. It taught me a lesson on how to be a manager of money.
In that connection with that occupation, the biggest job was collecting.
Correct.
Come back tomorrow was the word you heard a lot, didn't you?
Yes.
Come back tomorrow.
Come back tomorrow.
Yeah, but mention to him how many papers that you collected for when you left the papers at the building down there.
When I
Go back and get it
when I
off.
sold papers down in the Navy Annex, I had no problem getting my money then. I used to go back there and collect the money that I left the papers there, but I couldn't do it today. But back at that time, that's about 1957, I was able to just go ahead and collect my money from different annexes.
That was a major source of employment for young kids growing up in the area. The newspapers, we had 3 newspapers at the time. We had the Washington Post, the Times Herald, and the Washington Daily News.
Evening Star, Washington Post, Washington Daily News,
And
Times Herald, went to
most
Washington Post.
of the young boys at the time, there were
Paper rights.
very few girls, as I remember, serving.
We had one.
We had one?
We had one girl that served papers with the boys down Foggy Bottom.
Foggy Bottom was very progressive.
Yeah.
But you notice the word is used as served papers.
Right.
Yeah.
We
They
never
served
talked about
papers.
delivering papers.
Yeah,
the
never.
the operative word was served
They
papers.
served
Exactly.
papers.
And you had to also insert the papers together on Sundays.
On Sundays.
And I remember serving the Washington Times Herald when it was sold to the Washington Post. They put me out of work for a day or so. And then when they came together, the newspapers were this thick because they refused to eliminate any part of the paper for a while.
Yeah.
Strained my back. They'd come back tomorrow. They wouldn't be there the next day.
Would answer the door.
You know all about that.
Yeah.
In addition to talking about the work experiences, all of us in this stage this evening, although we have different ages, we shared a fondness for the sense of community. We shared growing up in the Foggy Bottom neighborhood. There were many historic events in and around the neighborhood. And Bradford Tatum told the G.W. Foggy Bottom Oral History Project about something he witnessed as a historic Easter Sunday in 1939, when one of the world's greatest opera singers, Marian Anderson, having been denied the right to sing at nearby Constitution Hall, instead had an audience of over 75,000 at one of the area's great landmarks.
I was at the Lincoln Memorial when Marian Anderson sang. I was on the first row, right on the first row. And of course that was like 1939 or something like that. Going back further, when the last parade of the Ku Klux Klan came to Washington in 1925.
Oh, wow.
Bradford Tatum is also a member of our church, but Bradford Tatum and my family, the King family, we go back to their childhood. And his brother was one of my closest friends, late brother Craig. But Bradford Tatum tells a story that I've heard told in my own home, including that march of the Ku Klux Klan in 1925. It was a memorable event for all the young people growing up at the time. My mother remembered it as if it were yesterday. When people speak of community, they think of a place where life has its own vibrancy, where families reach out to other families, where people look out for each other. But was it always that way in Foggy Bottom? I'd like to think that's the way it was, but really, was it always that way? Could you talk a little bit about Foggy Bottom and the role that class might have played in it, that color might have played in it? Were we all one, unified in Foggy Bottom? May I ask you, Mary Brown, your impressions of that time?
Well, yes, yes and no. Well, we had people living in the neighborhood were different nationalities, and my mother was a good cook. And especially on the weekends, like Sunday when she was baking her rolls that she made up on Saturday night, on Sunday morning, they would be standing at the front door waiting to get in. And she would tell them, "Come back later, I haven't fed my children yet, and I'll have some rolls ready for you." But we had one fellow, he was, what do you call, Jewish, Hebrew, or something like that, whatever they choose to call him. The nationality doesn't eat pork, but he would come all the time when she was cooking pig feet because he loved them and eat them. But on the whole, we had a neighborhood which was very congenial, and everyone treated everyone nice. They always went home at night to their own homes, but if you were cooking something, they'd come in and eat, and then they'd go home.
Well, my experience is everybody down there got along, and the ones that didn't get along, I wouldn't know about anyway, because only different races of people were mostly, to my knowledge, is the people that owned the stores, and their kids stayed there, but they didn't allow them to play with us anyway. So that's my experience growing up in Foggy Bottom. We basically stayed within each other's range and going to recreation centers, and that's where we got most of our entertainment from.
And I'm sort of like Murray was. I come from a long line of good cooks. And I guess a lot of people agree food tastes a whole lot better back then than it does now. But I was fortunate to know both of my great-grandmothers on maternal and paternal. But my great-grandmother on my father's side used to cook rolls every week. That was our bread, really, rather than have fresh bread. But she would send that to my other great-grandmother. And I was fortunate to be the delivery guy because I could get the fried bologna that was so good at my grandmother's house at 24th and F. So I made this track every week religiously, you know. So I mean, those are the type of things that the community had, and the worst part about it, I always thought that's the way it's supposed to be in the world. But it's not like that, you know, unfortunately.
Well, but wasn't that also not a time in Foggy Bottom's life when you had a mixture of income groups there who were all African Americans? I mean, you had doctors and you had teachers and you had your principals and you had your ministers and you had your undertakers and your undertakers and then your undertakers. Yeah. And you had preachers and churches. Yeah. But you also had, or did you have, let me just ask it this way, was there stratification there? Was there class stratification?
I don't think so.
You don't think so, but
I think so. Yeah.
Would you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I think doctors' kids, lawyers, like you say, they weren't really allowed to play with the so-called poor kids because they're afraid they're going to get into trouble because we weren't the best kids, but we were disciplined. If you saw me do something wrong, neighbors see me do something wrong, we're going to get a spanking. And we'll beg you, please don't tell daddy or mama, because if we go home, we're going to get another one. Mm-hmm. See? So, I mean, we had a good time, but we weren't angels, all of us weren't.
Do you recall anything like that, Ms. Brown?
Well, once in a while, not continually, but sometimes you'd have it.
Maybe it progressed
But
out.
sometimes the parents would step in and say, you don't act like that. But what comes from parents come down to children sometime and sticks.
So many of us on this stage have heard other voices talk about church, and they talked about attachment to places like St. Mary's on 23rd Street. And an event until today is being symbolized in this Foggy Bottom area. Ruth Reid, to us, told us why St. Mary's has been a constant in her life in Foggy Bottom.
For me, it was a spiritual thing. I'm telling you, I came here and stayed here because of the spiritual part of the church. And I feel good in here. I honestly feel good when I'm here in St. Mary's worshiping. So, I mean, I can only speak for me, and this is what keeps me coming back. Every Sunday, I brought my daughter back, who's now 45, and she took to the church just like I did. Immediately, this was her place.
Full disclosure, while my wife Gwen and I have been members of St. Mary's Church for a few years now, I was actually raised at the Liberty Baptist Church, which is across the street from St. Mary's on 23rd Street, and it existed up until, Liberty existed up until this year when George Washington University ate it. Now, my grandparents lived down the street from St. Mary's as well. And that was sort of our only connection to St. Mary's. My grandfather worked at St. Mary's as a sexton at the church. But he and St. Mary's parted company when Father Christian, I think it was a priest there at the time, didn't think much of my grandfather's fascination with grape and distilled spirits. Mary Brown, David Riley, James Briscoe, tell us about your connections to the faith community here in Foggy Bottom. Mary Brown, would you go?
Well, my mother brought me to St. Mary's when I was a baby. She said her mother went there before her. And I actually was vaccinated there to go to school. But I felt that it was really a highly spiritual church. And it was really very, they had a great outreach for the neighborhood and people who didn't even live in the neighborhood. But I felt that this was a place where you should go and you would have the good upbringing. Of course, you got that at home. But it was an uplifting place to attend. And it was really, I thought it was just fabulous growing up and attending St. Mary's and going to Sunday school there. And later on, I taught Sunday school. But to this day, I'm still really overwhelmed to be a member of St. Mary's.
Mary Brown is a fixture at St. Mary's. If you come any Sunday, you're going to find her sitting on the left side, not more than 2 rows, either the back row or the row just in front, but that's where she's going to be, not far from Miss Daisy. And if you haven't met Miss Daisy, you ought to come to meet Miss Daisy too. Miss Daisy drives.
Driving Miss Daisy.
Drives. You don't want to be near
In her way.
the car. Miss Daisy drives. Mr. Riley, tell us about your journey through the faith community in Foggy Bottom.
In Foggy Bottom, all I can remember is my mama made us go to St. Mary's when we were kids.
Coercion.
Coercion.
But
But. That was about the extent of mine.
It sounds like it was not a deep and meaningful experience, huh?
It wasn't.
you couldn't sit down unless you went there.
All right,
Unless I
well,
went
you
there.
win some, you lose some, huh? How about you, Mr. Bristol?
I have a history in Liberty Baptist and St. Mary's. Cub Scouts and Boy Scouts. Many great friends that I still know, a few that we met down in St. Mary's and had adventures. I attended Sunday school in Mount Zion in Georgetown, but my folks was always making sure we were busy, so on Saturdays or Fridays, we go to Cub Scouts and Boy Scouts. So although I moved near DuPont Circle and lived there for about 14 years, I was always down here. Like I said, my grandparents lived at 24th and F before the Watergate came. And so.
That was the interesting thing about Foggy Bottom when we all were there. We had many churches.
Yes.
Seems almost as if every block had a church.
Yes.
And if you go around the city now, you'll find things like Rock Creek Baptist Church, located on the eastern side of Georgia Avenue.
Right.
Rock Creek Baptist Church was in Foggy Bottom. But when the relocation took place and gentrification took place, churches had to move. So Rock Creek Baptist Church is as far from Rock Creek as you can get.
8th and Upshur.
8th Street now.
8th and Upshur.
8th.
8th
Yeah.
and Upshur, yeah.
8th and Upshur.
Yeah.
You have, 19th Street Baptist Church
16th Street.
used to be on 19th Street.
Right.
19th Street Baptist Church is now on 16th
16th
Street
Still has
in
a
the
name.
northern part of the city. All this is because of the changes that have taken place. Those changes, I think, brought some positive changes
Exactly.
and some negative changes with the exodus of the churches from the area because of the gentrification. Well, we're at a point now in our discussion where we want to give you, the audience, an opportunity to ask this panel any of the questions you might have about this area, what we might remember because of this home of, which is now George Washington University for over 100 years. We would like you to throw some questions our way. If you would like to raise your hand, and the microphone will come to you, and then you can fire away, and we will rearrange our memories and tell you things that not the way they were, but the way we'd like to think they were.
Hi there. My question is for Mr. Riley.
Yes.
It is Mr. Riley?
Yes.
Oh, I apologize. Mr. Riley, it is not you. It is this gentleman here.
Oh, he's here.
Briscoe. Mr. Briscoe, you mentioned that living in that area, you had the privilege of being in a multicultural community.
Mm-hmm.
And while I'm not a native Washingtonian, I've been here almost 30 years, and that seems to be a rare experience in other parts of Washington, D.C.
Okay.
How was your community multicultural, number one? And then the next question to you would be, how did that make your experience different from those who lived in D.C. in more segregated areas? And this question isn't just for you, Mr. Briscoe, but anybody on the panel who may have an answer.
That's fair, but I didn't realize we were multicultural at first. You know, when I was in the 50s in elementary school, it didn't mean nothing to me. You were just a person, for one thing. But I remember a young lady from Jordan. We went through the 3rd through the 6th grade together. A young man from Bulgaria. Don't get me wrong, this area was predominantly black, so the school was predominantly black. Most of my friends in the area were black, but there were people in the apartment buildings around here from other countries. They couldn't speak good English, some of them, but they learned from us and we learned from them. There was no disrespect. But once you get older and get out in the real world, or like some of the other areas where you know that where it's more segregated, it's not the same. But this is what I'm used to. I'm just sharing my experience as to what I experienced. I have friends now, at least 20 friends that I'm proud to say from the 1st grade. And a lot of people don't have that. You know what I mean? It doesn't make a difference to me whether they're black, white, green, or blue. You know, we went through that whole learning experience, and I'm gonna take it with me, you know?
There's something about Foggy Bottom that's worth noting. Foggy Bottom was never 100% black. It never was. My neighborhood was not that way. Our closest friends, 2 doors away, were white families. We did everything together except when school started. And he went his way and we went our way, and it's not because we took a vote or anything. This is the way the law said we had to behave. I don't think there were very few blocks, except maybe in the alley dwellings, where you could say it was 100%
Right.
black.
in the alleys, yes.
Otherwise, throughout the area, you could not identify really blocks and blocks of all blacks or blocks and blocks of all whites. It just didn't exist that way. It was unlike other parts of the city. That multiculturalism was there, but we all had to observe either the law or the customs that were prevalent at the time. But individual relationships, nonetheless, were struck up, and people maintained those relationships.
A lot of hands.
How about grocery stores in the area? You know, now there's things like Trader Joe's and Whole Foods and so on. Was it smaller family-owned stores in those days? Were they, Jewish-run, or what was the variety of shopping that you could do?
Most of our shopping was done at corner juice stores.
That's what they called it.
Yeah, that's
In
what
the
they called
That's what it was called,
called
juice store.
Jewish stores. And at that time, we were bouncing block to block. We may move 2 blocks away, 3 blocks away. We go to another store, and some of us left some bills behind, wasn't paid, and that's because they were accused of weighing their hand when they weigh our meat. So most of the family felt like they already got paid. They weigh their hands when you go for a half pound of bologna. They weigh their hand, may get you close to it, but it was never there. But we didn't have any. I think we had a DGS grocery store on 27th and K Street. 27.
And then the K Street Market. K
27.
Street Market was.
You heard something just a moment ago that's worth staying with, because you just heard a term used. And I heard that term used a lot growing up, too, in designating a store. I had no idea what they were talking about. It was a designation, but it was no relationship to race or religion or ethnicity. It was a term. Because we also grew up learning more about Israel and the Israelites than we probably did in school. But there was no connection made. But the term that he just used, which most people don't use now, but that he just used, this came right out. I remember hearing this. The juice store. Mr. Kolodny at 23rd and L. But I don't remember thumbs on the scale.
You don't?
I don't. I remember, what I do remember is this where you could go with a penny and get Mary Jane's.
Yeah.
And you could get pickles.
Yeah.
And you could
Peppermint
get
stick.
these peppermint sticks and stick them in the pickles. And that he had the coldest sodas you could find because he had blocks of ice there. And he was the first person who hired me. First job I ever had, working with Mr. Kolodny.
Well,
And he was the place, and it was a place where Mr. Kolodny and people like Mr. Kolodny kept spiral notebooks.
Yeah.
And Mama would send you there to get something from the store. Mr. Kolodny would give it to you and write it down and not take a dime. Not take a dime from you.
All of them did that.
And when Mama got paid or Daddy got paid, that's when you could go pay him. Is that right?
Exactly.
That's correct.
Exactly.
But that's the only source of their income was us, because we're the only ones buying from them.
But it was mutual.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it was mutual.
I'm gonna tell you my experience. I worked at the corner store, Vic's, right up the street from my house. I must have been about 8 years old. I was making $3 a week. Every time I get paid, I go and spend that money right back in the store, buying candy, tater chips. He was happy. When I went, my mother took that $3 and bought me a pair of tennis shoes. He got angry when I came back with no money and watched me all the time. That's my experience.
Well, any other experiences?
No, but I'm glad he mentioned 8 years old, because I've been telling the Social Security Administration I've been working since I was 8 years old. Just thought I'd mention that, you know.
Well, I'm gonna have to rattle out. My wife was former commissioner of Social Security Administration, right down there. So talk to her.
That's good. That's good. It's good to know. It's good to know.
She's in the audience,
I'll give you
too.
the numbers when I finish it.
Hey, good evening, everybody. It's good to see you
Hello.
here. I, too, am a proud D.C. native. 1954, Columbia Hospital for Women.
Hey, some of the better Americans were born at Columbia Hospital.
I'm telling you.
My baby was.
Except for those of us who got the forceps, I just never recovered from it. What I wanted to ask you about was something that I thought was unique about my neighborhood. I grew up in Northeast, up off of South Dakota Avenue. And of the 36 families on our block, every family had a father in the home. Had a father in the home.
Exactly.
And we had one who died early and one who was an alcoholic who was in and out of prison. But everybody else had a father in the home. I wonder if your community was the same, and if you could just talk about, the fathers and their role in the homes and in your neighborhoods.
Yes, we all had fathers, and the mothers saw to that in those days, too. And, of course, they looked after you, over you like, mother hen. The father did the same thing. You had to be in at a certain time at night. And even if you went to the movies, we used to have a theater called the Blue Mouse at that time at 26 and M. And he would go from work and pay for us. We never knew what it cost to go to the movies, and they'd send us all over there. And Mr. Martin would say, "You Brown, sit over there." And then he'd tell him that we could not buck the movies, send us home after the movie was over the first time. Right.
Let me just translate that. Buck the movie means stay for the second showing.
That was a regular thing.
That was a regular thing. You always tried to buck the movie.
We weren't allowed to do that. We had to be back home because when we were tiny, we had gas lights on the street corners, and there used to be a little short guy'd come along and light the gas lights. And when you saw him coming down the street, you knew that was time to go in the house. And if you weren't in the house, you were on the way to the house, you were in trouble. Either your mother or your father would come out. That was bad. That was very bad. And it reminds me when after I moved to the place I live now, I'd had a Greek, my next door neighbor was Greek, and she would tell me all the time, "Miss Brown," she says, "you come out and you stand on the back porch and you clap your hands 3 times. She said, "And Bill comes running." I said, I grew up that way. I said, so either your mother or your father came out, and if you looked up and saw them out there, you better get home. Because everyone looked out for each other, as well as the neighbors. If you went around the corner, they'd ask you, "Does Gert Brown know you around the corner here?" Not, "I'm going to the grocery store." "Okay." Not, "Get on back around there." Everybody looked out for everybody's children. There was always a father and a mother there. There you go.
My experience is everybody didn't have a father in the house. In fact, I didn't have one in the house. My mother raised 8 of us single-handedly. And that's why, yes, when I was 8 and when I got 12 years old, I was working, making money. I never thought my parents were supposed to buy me clothes. I bought my own ever since. So everybody really wasn't blessed to have a father in the house.
I would say the same thing, but at the same time, my experience was I had multiple parents because I could walk for blocks and somebody knew my father or somebody knew my mother, and I think that was a big part of the community. If I was out of money, I could stop at one of my friend's house and his father would give me movie money or whatever if I was lucky, but I'm saying I'm in agreement with Mr. Riley. Everybody didn't have a mom and a dad, but the the community kind of took care of the folks. We had folks that didn't have no parents that were welcome in our house to eat. You know, I've got a dear friend now that speaks about that all the time. He didn't want to be with his mother and father, his father and stepmother, but he enjoyed coming to our house because there was an environment there, whatever, you know. So,
What you did have in those days, if you didn't have a father, there was an uncle,
yeah, could be
or there was a male cousin, there was a grandfather. There was a man in the family.
yes.
There were role models. We saw every day men leave home to go to work and come back home from work to their homes. Some were fathers, some were uncles, some were stepbrothers, fathers, but they were men who were doing productive things, taking care of their families or assisting in the take care of their families. And that's what I think if you contrast then with now, that's the experience that a lot of kids don't have. Not only do they not have a man in the house, they don't have the role models that will show them the importance of work, of deferred, delayed gratification, of being responsible and caring for other individuals. That we did have in Foggy Bottom. That was present there. It was also important, and I come back to this point, the faith community was critical to the security of kids there. I mean, one thing that was great about it, churches were open during the week. And what was good about that was if you were in a neighborhood and you had a little trouble and you couldn't get from the source of the trouble to your home, there was some church open somewhere where they were having an evening meeting, and you could duck in there, and that was a sanctuary. Yeah. And you could stay in there until the trouble went past. But if you go now into our communities on the week, Mondays through Fridays, Saturdays, churches are locked up like fortresses. You can't get inside.
People steal now.
And there's a community resource that they're not there.
Good evening. I'm Maggie, and I attend St. Mary's Church. And I also work at George Washington University. I would love to have you talk a little bit about the exchange that you had with George Washington University students. Did you know them? Did you see them on the streets? Did you talk to them? Did they babysit for you? Or was it a town and gown experience?
I've got a good experience with GW students. And I hope I got this right. 19th Street Baptist Church, this is the big white church back here, right?
It's not there now.
I know, but that's what it was.
It used to be on 19th Street.
Origin of the church.
Yeah.
Well, you know, I don't remember the age exactly, but I think I was about 15. And they had drama students here at GW. And they came, I think, through the Boy Scouts to St. Mary's. And they asked who would be interested in learning how to act. Of course, so I'm never worked out, by the way, but I mean, you know. But we were doing plays with the students at GW. And we used to travel all through here from Grant School. When GW had the best lawns for playing touch football, for one, by the way. Not that we destroyed them or anything, but we would play a good game of tackle and pile on many of the lawns right there, 23rd Street and a couple of more areas. But it was a good experience I had. My one and only experience in acting was at the old church there. And I don't know what happened to that group, but they were very active in getting kids, young African-American kids from around the neighborhood. And I don't know whatever happened to it, if anybody ever came up, but I certainly enjoyed that and etched in my memory. But
any other
they were cool.
experiences? Any other experiences with GW that you'd like to tell?
Well, one thing, quite a few of GW students do volunteer work at our St. Mary's Court there, and they are very helpful. Some of them come to our church sometime, but I think they do a marvelous job with the seniors there at St. Mary's Court. I'll give them applause for that.
My first experience with St. Mary's was after a service at Liberty Baptist Church. Jerry Lewis was having his telethon, and Lisner Auditorium was the source for the local telethon. And Lisner Auditorium was only a block away, 2 blocks away from Liberty Baptist Church. And I had the thrill of my life, and this is going to be lost on a lot of the younger people here. But the person who was running the local telecast was George Gabby Hayes. Anybody?
Yeah,
Anybody? Anybody?
My favorite restaurant.
Roy Rogers' sidekick. Roy Rogers, everybody knows.
I'm a restaurant.
I find I have to do that now because there is this age difference that we have. But I went up and I saw Gabby Hayes, and Gabby Hayes gave me his autograph, and I have to thank George Washington University for that, among other reasons for thanking George Washington.
Can you all talk a little bit about, you only mentioned the word gentrification, you mentioned the word alley dwellings. Can you talk a little bit about, and also George Washington got here in 1912, and it was only 1 block and 1,000 students. It's about 20,000 students now. It's expanded a great deal. What was the neighborhood response to that expansion? What was gentrification like for you? Other neighborhoods have talked about it. I'd like to hear from you all.
Who else to go first?
Not me.
Not you. Mary?
Talk about George Washington's expansion here. A lot of people sort of resented it, I know, but it also meant menial jobs for a lot of people down here also. But on the whole, I think the majority of people got to get around to welcome GW. Even though it relocated a lot of people, but hey,
GW bought,
what you can say, it brought a lot to the area.
GW bought Liberty Baptist Church. GW bought a lot of real estate.
A lot of the courts were gone. A lot of the Snow's Court and a lot
That's
of
Hughes
the alley
Mills.
dwellings
The alley dwellings,
were gone.
Snow's Court,
Long before.
That's
Hughes Court.
Mills and whatever now. They're still here.
They'll
but
call it Hughes Mills now. It was Hughes
whatever.
Court at the time.
That was the
Hughes
alley
Mills.
dwellings.
That's what it is now.
Hughes Mills.
But what happened, there was a serious dislocation
Still in the alley.
as a result of acquisition of the churches and the acquisition of the homes. And the fact that you had home dwellers, people who dwelled in those residences, but they weren't owners. They were renters. And so when the time came for not only GW, but others who recognized the importance of the location to acquire property, they had no difficulty buying property. And the people who lived there had no recourse except to move. My family owned our house. We found ourselves in a situation where our church was gone to another part of town. Our friends were gone to another part, scattered around the town. There was literally no reason to stay in a part of town that we really loved because what we had as a community it's gone. I don't, in some ways it's progress, but we lost something important as a result of those changes, as is happening now in the city and in other parts of the city as well. But that's another conversation.
Hello. I am a native Washingtonian also, and I was born in Columbia Hospital for Women. I
know join the crowd.
This great people came out of that hospital, no doubt about it.
That's true. That is true. My parents told me that during the time when I was born, I won't give you the year, but it's after you guys. But they told me that during that time and before, there were only 2 hospitals where black children could be born, and that was Howard University Hospital and Columbia Hospital for Women. I'm just wondering if that was an experience that you encountered as well?
I was born in Georgetown University Hospital in 1950.
No, you'd have to look at the time for this. First of all, it was Freedman's Hospital, not Howard University Hospital. Columbia Hospital, Gallinger Hospital, which became Greater South, became
Capitol Hill.
Not Capitol Hill.
No, that's.
Oh, K. Fritz.
Not K. Fritz. No. D.C. General.
General.
Thank you.
There you go.
Thank you.
D.C. General.
But I don't think that's true, that there were just two hospitals, at least not in my experience. And there were kids who were born at home. My sister was born at 2326 L Street, which still is there.
And I was born at 2623 Virginia Avenue.
There was a lot of that happened.
I was born at 830 New Hampshire Avenue. The house is still there. I got my certificate of live birth. I'm thinking about going down there and claiming it. It's still there.
And I have a brother that was born at home at 23rd and H also. So I've heard that rumor before, though. Only two hospitals.
There's more than two.
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Robert Newkirk, third. Want to know, you spoke about how, I guess, gentrification, we lost some things. How can we prevent that going forward?
You can't prevent it. You can't prevent it. All you can do is manage change. But change is going to... Change is inevitable. This is a reflection of economic realities. To the extent that people who are dwelling where they are now can own their own homes, they can remain where they are. If they're renters and they don't have the capacity to handle the increased taxation that takes place as a result of being homeowners, they're gonna move. But you know, that is not a function. That's a function of class. Race is reflected in that, but it's really a function of class. And what we see in the city now is a large arrival of younger people, more affluent, better educated, who find the attractiveness of living in an urban setting so great that this is what they want to do. That's going to happen. But some of those younger people, 20s and 30s, more affluent, who come in here, are kids of color as well, young people of color as well. But the thing is that makes the difference is the fact that they have the economic capacity to do these things. And people who don't are the ones who lose. Now, how do we address that? It's a long, long answer, but you start with, and I hate to say it because it can't be done overnight, but you start with getting this school system, educational system up to par where kids acquire the knowledge and the skills to allow them to get occupations, jobs that will allow them to earn a decent living, a middle-class, middle-income lifestyle. You gotta level that economic playing field. If you don't do that, you're going to have this kind of change taking place that is, in many ways, unwelcome because of the people who end up being on the losing end. But the change is inevitable.
Hi, I have a question about manufacturing. It sounds like from the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s that all of you and your families were able to find work in manufacturing or in businesses in the area. And I just wanted you to talk a little bit about your parents, your families going to work in this area. I mean, what was available?
You made some references to it earlier about where businesses were located in the city.
Yeah, K Street area. And most of the people I knew, of course, my father worked down there. He didn't live with us, but he worked at Carson and Grooming for a long time. After he had his own business, for some reason, he lost it. But he was working in one of the construction companies down there. And most of the people that I knew, their fathers were working down there, either the construction company, Concrete Company or the Huffmar, and different little places down there to work. So it wasn't a problem for most of them.
Yeah, you could find work at places like the Naval Gun Factory, munitions work, a lot of work in like, I'm thinking of the large company on 24th Street, just before we got to Stevens Francis Junior High School, the Gishner.
I worked at
Ironworks.
Ironworks, yeah.
Hired dozens of people from the neighborhood. You could find work because it was probably unskilled labor, but there was a lot of manufacturing work that could be found. That's changed now. We had beer companies. We had the beer company breweries that hired people. Milk companies, Chestnut Farms, Embassy Milk Company, all of those places are gone now that provided sources of employment for people who lived in the area. Blue-collar work, largely, but steady work, work that enabled individuals to raise families.
Cab drivers.
And then there were the cab drivers. Oh, yeah. Oh, the cab drivers.
Government workers.
Well, then in the 40s, by the time we got up to the 40s after the war, Pearl Harbor Day, practically everyone who could pass the civil service test got jobs in federal government. Practically my whole family went in. I went in August 42 and worked. My rating was War Service Indefinite at that time, but then gradually you got permanent status. So I stayed on, starting with the old War Department. I went in the Pentagon when it was partially completed. And later I worked for a couple of years on the Federal Security Agency at St. Elizabeth's Hospital. Then I got a statement call from the Navy Department, and that's where I stayed until 1985. But all along the early 40s, everyone practically went to work from Foggy Bottom in the federal government.
Exactly. I've got
my whole family.
20, 25 people in my family that have retired from the government, including myself.
Yeah.
We have time for just a couple of more questions here. And this wonderful conversation we hope will continue. You'll join us upstairs. GW invites you to a wonderful reception hosted by Ben's Chili Bowl, which will give us a real Washingtonian flavor. We have one question here, and then Alex has one over here. Yes, ma'am.
On East Street between 20th and 19th Street, there was a stadium where there is now parkland. Do any of you remember any of the events that took place there, or were you involved?
East Street between...
That was Turner's, that was
20th and
arena.
19th,
No,
just opposite
Turner's.
the...
No, Turner's is sport, but it was an arena for sports.
Excuse me?
An arena for sports.
I don't remember that.
I don't remember it either. Sorry.
I don't remember. 19,
But you have to be
yeah, hi. I actually just wanted to kind of address what this young man had asked about gentrification. And so I'm one of those gentrifiers now. I'm a newbie to Washington. But I also come from a community where there is gentrification and things happening. And although I agree with long-term solutions, I also think that there's some short-term ones where we can manage some of that change. And it really has to do with housing policies and around urban development issues. So I think if we do rent control, if we do affordable housing projects, if we do those things, then you afford people that are currently in those communities to stay in those communities. I mean, I know that me and my family were a product of that. I was lucky enough to be born and raised in Santa Monica, and thanks to rent control, my mother's still able to afford an apartment there. Had it not be for rent control policies, we definitely would no longer have lived there.
That's it. Time's up.
Well, I thank you. You've been a wonderful audience. You're all invited to continue the conversation, as Mr. Golden said, as we move to the second floor for refreshments from another D.C. institution. I want you to doff your hats and drop your heads when you hear me say, Ben's Chili Bowl. They've come to GW this evening, bringing us these refreshments. Our thanks to President Stephen Knapp, who just makes everything possible for us in Foggy Bottom. Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, wonderful audience. And let's also thank Mary Brown, James Briscoe, David Riley, and on to Ben's Chili Bowl.